Welcome to The Connecting Place with Andrea Fabry, making the connection between health and your environment. Now, here's your host, Andrea Fabry.
Well, what is technology doing to our kids' brains, and what is it doing to ours as adults and parents? Whether it's our obsession with Pokemon Go or sleeping with our smartphones, technology has literally engulfed our culture. Today we're going to talk about the Pokemon Go craze as well as the American Academy of Pediatrics' new policy on virtual violence as we talk with Dr. Victoria Dunckley. Dr. Dunckley is an integrative psychiatrist, author of the book Reset Your Child's Brain, a 4-week plan to end meltdowns, raise grades, and boost social skills by reversing the effects of electronic screen time. Welcome to the Connecting Place, Dr. Dunckley.
Thanks, Andrea. Happy to be here.
Let's start with this new policy from the American Academy of Pediatrics. This is huge on virtual violence. What is your thought on this?
Well, I think this is sort of what they've been saying all along. It's just that this particular statement has kind of clarified things and does a really good job describing why there's a risk. So basically, they're just talking about how virtual violence has its own special risks. It's for one thing, most of the games that kids play are actually a lot more violent than parents realize, and cartoons are very violent. So that's one issue. The other issue is the first-person shooter games and getting desensitized to violence, glamorizing carrying a weapon, things like that. But a lot of it's the desensitization and just kind of the normalization of violence, or using violence as a tool to get ahead in the game or whatever. But we know this already from, there's like 6 decades of research on media violence that it does increase aggression. And now it's just so prevalent that it's kind of become the norms. And, obviously we're seeing so much violence in the news today. And, the chances are most of the shooters are gamers. So I think it's really important to take a look at these things. And we know that, gaming addicts have a part of their damage to the brain that plays a role in empathy. And we know that in general, young adults today have lower empathy scores than they used to. So our brains are changing, and it's probably not only from the violence. I think the empathy piece is from just using screens as well and having reduced human contact.
And what type of interaction do you have with parents and children when it comes to gaming addiction and particularly violence? What do you see in your practice?
I mean, fortunately, a lot of the parents I see don't allow violent games. So I kind of feel like that's a given that they shouldn't be playing violent games. I guess I shouldn't always assume. But I think, kids will be more aggressive if they play any kind of games, whether they're racing games or even, games like Minecraft and things like that, just because any kind of screen stimulation can make them more dysregulated and affect the arousal system. So I see a lot of kids who are more aggressive in general just because of screen time. Obviously if they're doing violent things, that's going to make it a little bit worse. But the bigger factor is the total amount of screen time versus the content.
So a parent doesn't necessarily or shouldn't necessarily breathe a sigh of relief and say, well, my child doesn't play those violent games. He or she just enjoys the games. And you're saying, no, in a sense, it really doesn't matter.
Exactly. And although I do like how they said something in here about these violent games aren't appropriate for any child, no matter what their age. I think that's definitely true. That's a given that we shouldn't be putting those kind of images and actions into the psyche of a developing mind. But I think you're absolutely right. That is a huge misconception that parents think that it's safe as long as the game's not violent, and that's just not true.
One of the other things this policy suggests is that pediatricians prescribe a media diet. And I bet, again, you've been doing this for a very long time. This is your passion, but how do you respond when you see that in writing?
I mean, that's wonderful, because I think the more that we become aware of those kind of terms and that pediatricians are recommending those, it helps, makes my job a lot easier. But I think in this particular one, they're kind of talking, it's kind of a general term. They're not really being very specific. And that's part of the problem in general, I think, is parents don't know what that means. They don't know what the limits should be. And even in other articles, the American Academy has talked about less than 1 to 2 hours a day, in general of screen time. But for some of the kids that I see that have any kind of special needs or ADHD or anything like that going on at the same time, sometimes even an hour is too much. Sometimes 30 minutes, once a week is too much. So I think the parents need to realize that for their child, even if they're following the guidelines, it still might be too much.
Yeah, and I do want to get to some specifics. For parents who are taking the time to listen to this broadcast, they want to know. They want to know how. Because I've been a parent for 31 years, and now my youngest is 15, and what a difference in parenting compared to when we started.
Oh, yes.
And it's as if it just kind of came at us. I didn't even realize that it was happening, and I know young parents now are getting, infants tablets because that's so accepted. So I want to talk about the limits. I just want to go back to something you said. Most of the shooters are likely to be gamers or gaming addicts. Talk more about that.
Well, I think, I have to be careful about that because obviously there's a lot of factors that go into what causes someone to, take violence to that extreme. And, I think something like 95% of teens and young men game. So obviously not all of them are becoming, acting out in that way. But I think if we only look at the shooters, that's one thing. But if we look at all acts of aggression, clearly there's an association with violent gaming and any type of gaming and screen time in general. So the more screen time there is, the more likely a child is to be aggressive, act out, because they're just not able to regulate their stress levels.
And it's not their fault. And
Right.
I think we just kind of shame them into what no, it's just a game. But this is actually triggering something in the brain, you said.
Right. And part of, one of the jobs of growing up is learning to control your impulses, learning to take in all this information that's, in our environment around us through all 5 of our senses, and then processing that inside the brain, and then acting, putting it out into the environment, as you're acting on your environment. So all of these things it's a very dynamic system. So you can imagine if this kind of input is influencing a child on a regular basis, it makes it a lot harder for that child to learn to be able to self-regulate. And that's really the key here is, if someone can regulate themselves, which is something that we're supposed to learn as our brain develops, then even if they're mad, they're not going to act out. But the children who can't self-regulate, who just explode when they get the littlest frustration, or they can't process their emotions without it becoming intolerable, those are the kids that end up in trouble.
All right, so if you were to prescribe the media diet to you, if you were a practicing pediatrician, you're an integrative psychiatrist, so you're dealing with people who specifically want this kind of help, but you're an average pediatrician, and it was very vague in this policy that pediatricians should be prescribing a media diet. What would your ultimate diet be?
Well, I think the first thing that, I think pediatricians and child psychiatrists should be doing is taking an inventory. So taking, how many devices does a child have? What kinds of things are they doing? How many hours a day? And how many hours a day does school add, both in school and for homework? Because that can be really eye-opening to see how many hours a day it is. Then, I think if the general recommendations from the academy is, like I said, less than 1 to 2 hours a day of entertainment screen time. That's what they say. But I think that's still a lot considering how much kids are getting in school these days. So, what I do for, one way that I would say, describe a media diet for the average family would just be the child has to be doing well in school, doing chores, being respectful, sleeping well, exercising. They have to be functioning pretty well to earn any screen time at all. So if all of those things are happening, then you can say, okay, maybe they can have some on the weekends. And that way you're getting through the whole school week without adding any in there. And then if they can handle a little bit on the weekends, so be it. I think that probably works better than most of the other guidelines I've heard. Because if you think about even 1 to 2 hours a day, kids are in school, and then if they're in sports or something after that, and then they have homework, like, where are they fitting in this 1 to 2 hours a day? They really don't need to,
Is watching a movie that's a set time, is that better than just free on the internet in your mind?
Yes, actually, absolutely. And there's studies that show that when kids know there's a definite end, whether it's a movie or a game, that they have a much easier time stopping. So these games that never end, the internet doesn't end, that's like it's a form of having no boundaries, it's not developmentally supportive. That's the kind of thing that makes us all crazy. But when you're growing up, you need clear boundaries, and so that's a really good point. I think is to try to absolutely stay away from these games that go on and on forever. And then same thing with the internet. That's the problem with the internet is when does it end? Even social media, like there's no end to it. So I think doing things like that where there's a show that's a certain length and then it goes off. A game that's a certain length and it goes off. When the child knows that, it helps them realize it's going to end, and it helps them feel in a little bit more control.
What is the earliest age you would give a child a device or access to the computer?
Well, I think, and you probably know this about me, Andrea, is that I'm probably more conservative than most people because of what I see. And there's so many things I see that are related to screen time that aren't obvious. So it's obvious when a child is playing all day long that there's a problem. But a lot of the issues I see with whether it's a learning issue, behavior issue, anxiety, a lot of it's related to screens. Or even if they had that issue, the screen time makes it worse. So I'm very, very strict. But I also know that once a device is introduced to the child or into the home, it's very hard to get it out. So I always say, less is more. If you can keep things out of the home, they're gonna get introduced to a computer in kindergarten. So if you don't hand them your phone, if you don't hand them a tablet when they're that young, they're still gonna know how to use a computer, but they're not gonna be so attached to it.
What about a cell phone?
I like Waldorf's philosophy. They don't use in their schools. They don't introduce computer time until age 12, and that to me is more developmentally appropriate because that is when the brain is more able to. It's just starting to be able to control impulses.
And so what's the earliest age you would give a child a phone? Because, as they start to go to friends and all this, having them have a phone can be a good thing. But, of course, it comes with all sorts of negatives. What about that? I still struggle with that question all the time. To me, they shouldn't have a phone at all. I always say, at least 16 or 17, and then just give them a flip phone, and see how well they handle it. Certainly not this early age, a lot of parents are giving their kids a phone at 10 or 12. That's just crazy to me. So another rule I heard that I thought that was a really good idea was you give it to them when they can afford to pay it themselves, their own bill. So that would mean they would need to be working part-time or something to help pay for their portion. But I think, just giving them the phone and then kind of not really regulating what they're doing on it or, letting them have it in the morning before school, and things like that, it's just a slippery slope. And what about as parents? It kind of starts with us in a lot of ways. And
right.
I got rid of my smartphone finally. I'd had it for a year.
You did?
Yeah, I did.
Wow.
It was, yeah. And I wrote an article about how I did it because it was so hard on so many levels. But I just realized having teenagers, and they just have flip phones for when they're out, and same thing. We just have tried to discourage it. This is learning after the fact. We've had to back out of technology, which you're right, it's much harder. It was much harder for me to give it up than to get it. But the impact on me personally has been profound in terms of my brain health, let alone the example it's setting for my kids. But I want you to talk about parents, you know. How can we expect our kids to have boundaries when we don't?
Right. I mean, it's a huge issue. We know that modeling, however the parent acts, definitely influences how the children behave. So it is really important. From my perspective, it's really hard to get parents to cut back. But what they can do is start with talking to their child about how their screen time affects the child. So a lot of little kids will say, mommy's on her phone all the time or daddy's on the computer. And when parents hear that coming from the child, that it tugs on their heartstrings, and they can see that it's like hurtful, because the child feels neglected. And those little, instances of being ignored are happening all day long, and it's causes these little traumas, and then that makes them more likely as they get older to want to associate with their peers who are on their phones or on social media, et cetera. So like one of the concepts that Richard Freed talks about, who wrote Wired Child, is that kids today are separating from their parents a lot earlier than they used to, and joining their peers. So I think parents need to think about maintaining that bond with their child, and that only recently were teenagers separating from their parents so early. I don't know if I'm making sense.
No,
right now.
because I'm thinking of a 10-year-old who gets a phone and their friends in 5th grade or whatever age 10 is have them. I can see where it's almost like handing them a way of separating from me too early.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. And parents who, like the directors of Screenagers, they were, one of the mothers was saying that, the movie is about her and her teen daughter, but they ended up giving her a phone, and they had a contract and everything. But like that mother still talks about like how she misses her child, and it's really a lot. It's a loss. Parents are going through like a grief process because they feel like they've lost their children, and they really have. So I think if they can begin with asking the child, having a really honest conversation with the child about how the parent's screen time makes the child feel, and then talking about what rules the entire family can have, because parents get super defensive about, well, I have to use it for work or I have to use it for that. But I think all of us could cut back, and all of us can live by certain rules and having sacred zones, like whether it's dinner, making dinner, after dinner, where you just put your phone away, turn it off. Like in our household, we come in the door, your phone goes to the charger and it's off. I never have my ringer on. So just getting into habits like that. And then you can also do what I call like the accountability act. So if someone violates a family rule or, a household rule, then that person, whether it's the child or the parent, has to pay a tax of some sort. And the tax ends up, going into the money jar for pizza night or something like that, where something where the family can do something together. But that way everyone's kind of accountable, and, parents just need to be honest about their own use and try to model as best they can. And, we're all human, so it's okay to make mistakes. But the more that you model honesty, then even if you're making mistakes, the child's going to see that.
Yeah. Pokemon Go. I have to get you to comment on that. I mean, this is unbelievable. 7.5 million downloads in less than a week. It's just staggering. But there would be those who would say it's getting people outside. It's getting them exercise. It's getting them interaction. I'd love to hear your response to Pokemon Go.
Oh my gosh. I just feel like it's such a testimony to what is going on in our world today that everyone's so thrilled that their child's going outside. It's just crazy. That is a big part of the conversation, is that, oh, kids are outside and they're walking around, like it's a miracle. So I think it just speaks to how out of line everything's gotten. But I think that, I always am concerned when there's a game that kids are so obsessed with, like with Minecraft, for example. Parents often think, oh, well, it's a game that helps build their creativity. It's so cool. You should see what my kid does. But really, that's one of the most addictive games. So I think anything like this, you want to be careful, because when you see behavior like that, it's activating the reward pathways in the brain in a very intense manner. And if it's unnatural stimulation like that, it tends to wear those pathways out. So then they become harder they don't work as well, because they're worn out. And that's the addiction process. So, and we know that screen addiction it increases the risk for all other kinds of addiction, whether it's alcohol or drugs or whatever. So, especially in a developing brain. So we always want to be careful about games that kids get really obsessed with. And, I've been hearing stories of kids who, walked 30 miles and stuff like that. Like, that's not normal. But my other concern about this game is the augmented reality part of it, because kids, their sense of reality is still developing. And, like part of this American Academy of Pediatrics statement was saying that kids can't always distinguish between fantasy and reality. And when you kind of combine the two, you're blurring the line even more. So that would be my concern, is that, we already are seeing kids who hallucinate from video games, and even adults hallucinate from video games. And sometimes I see kids that they're so involved in either cartoon characters or a character from a video game that they almost, they believe that they're that character, and the parents thinks, is this normal or not? So my concern would be things like that it would really kind of disturb their sense of reality.
So what can parents of teens do? Because, and maybe we can kind of conclude by offering some good news that you've seen happen when parents intervene and limit and draw lines, and the kids and how they respond. But particularly for teenagers, what have you seen happen, the positive, when a parent intervenes, when they feel at first so powerless over all of this?
Mm-hmm. I think when they do intervene, studies show that if they just try to limit it, it does help. But for some children and teens, if you really eliminate it for 3 to 4 weeks, eliminate all gaming, computer use, etc., it helps everyone break away from that. It helps the child's nervous system reset. Their body clock normalizes, or resynchronizes. Because we have to remember, this is a lot of intense light and unnatural light that we're all getting. So everyone's body clock is off. It helps the brain chemistry normalize, stress hormones lower. But obviously, at the same time, it helps the child or teen engage in real life again, and they start to become interested in things, other things again. And so it kind of liberates the brain, I call it. And at the same time, then the parent and the child start spending more time together. And it's the same thing with teens too. Teens, parents always think teens don't want to spend time with them, but they do. They'll play a board game with you. They want to hang out too. They really still have that need for the parent. So you often will see relationships heal, and I think it's really important. Those are and it's interesting because the addiction pathways are the same as the bonding pathways in the brain. So that's one theory, is that, those addiction pathways hijack pathways that are already there, but those pathways are meant for bonding. So when you remove the games, if you replace it with bonding and one-on-one time or family time, then you're actually rewiring the brain the way it's supposed to be, and also giving them a bit of protection.
So you've seen that you can, of course, that bonding addiction pathway is fascinating, but you've seen this happen in real life, right? Parents come in, you've seen it work.
I have, yes. It's obviously, there's a learning curve, and when they first take everything away, it's like a miracle. I mean, the child is so much better. So many things get better. Their grades go up. It's like everything across the board is fantastic. Then they try to, reintroduce or see if the child can tolerate a little bit. And that's where the learning curve comes in, because almost immediately, they either allow too much too soon or things just fall apart again. So they have to really kind of do a lot of trials to figure out what's going to work. And a lot of times they end up having to be way more strict than they ever imagined. But over time, over a period of months, then the more methodical and strict they are about it, they can really start to see huge changes in the child. And then I've seen a lot of teens, after a period of months, they can self-reflect and kind of see how different they feel and that they don't want to feel the way they used to feel. So they'll have more insight about how the screens affected them. It's like they can step back a little bit. And they also can see it in their friends. They can see, that their friends don't have anything interesting to talk about unless it has to do with screens, or they see how limited their interests are, or that their friends are more immature, things like that. So you really do start to see a kind of an expansion of the teen's brain. Now, of course, they still might bug you all the time about getting their device back or whatever. But so I always tell parents they really have to keep their eye on the ball and constantly be reminding themselves what's going on. I mean, like you were saying earlier, parenting today is like 100 times harder than it used to be. It's ridiculous.
Well, I really appreciate all the work you're doing. I can't recommend your book enough. Reset Your Child's Brain, a 4-week plan to end meltdowns, raise grades, and boost social skills by reversing the effects of electronic screen time. Dr. Victoria Dunckley, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Andrea. I appreciate it.
You've been listening to The Connecting Place, making the connection between health and your environment. Join us again next time for The Connecting Place with Andrea Faber.